Hello my dearest darklings, and welcome to Darkwytch Travels. We are still in Edinburgh, and this week we will be looking at Greyfriars Kirkyard. Kirk is an old Scottish word for church. We will be interviewing Jamie, the manager of the City of the Dead Souls, who has worked in the kirkyard for 15 years.
Greyfriars. The Greyfriars Kirkyard itself, it goes right back to the 1400s.
Okay.
First established, this was the grounds of the Greyfriars Monastery. Greyfriars were Franciscan monks. They wore grey habits, so they were known as Greyfriars. Dominican monks were Blackfriars because they wore black habits. So this was all the grounds for the Greyfriars Monastery. They were self-sufficient. They had their herb gardens. They had orchards. So they were pretty much self-sufficient. They grew their own vegetables and things like that. So this was all their land. The monastery used to be situated down in the north yard by what is now the grass market area. It's kind of overlapped. Back then, though, it was a natural valley. This is long before the burials happened. So after many reformation after reformation, the monastery would be destroyed and ransacked, and then they'd rebuild, and then it'd be ransacked again. So they decided, coming into the sort of 1500s, that this wasn't for them. They were sick, so they abandoned the monastery, and it was left a ruinous state. The grounds were still here, but it was just land, really. It was served no real purpose. Now there was burials already happening from the 1400s for the monks who died, so they were buried here already. So it was already a kind of form of burial ground. So what happened was, we come into the 1500s, and sort of mid 1500s, the main burial ground for Edinburgh was St Giles in the High Street. What is now the car park was the burial ground for the centre of Edinburgh, well, Edinburgh City. We were a walled-in city, so it was all done within the walls, the confines of the walls. But obviously, space, more death due to disease, things like that. Especially in the sort of 1500s, it was rife right through till the 1600s. So there was a lot of death. We needed burials place that was bigger. Down the back of the natural gradient off the slope from the Royal Mile to the Cowgate at St Giles, the bodies were coming out of the ground. The landslides were happening because of the weight. So we really needed to do something. That was when Mary Queen of Scots stepped in the 1560s, and 1563, she decided to grant the land of the Greyfriars Monastery to the people of Edinburgh as a new burial ground. So it became the Greyfriars Burial Ground. This is still before the church was founded. There's a lot of people who claim that Mary Queen of Scots gave the church to the people of Edinburgh. Mary had already been dead for a good old 70 odd years before the church was founded. Mary never gave the church, she gave the ground of the Greyfriars Monastery to the people of Edinburgh to be used as a burial ground. So yeah, then it became Greyfriars Burial Ground, and it remained to be the main burial ground for Edinburgh for almost 300 years.
As we walk around Greyfriars, you may come to realise that there are quite a few hills and valleys within the kirkyard itself. There's rather a grisly explanation as to why this is the case. Here's Jamie again.
You know, there's none of this 6 foot deep stuff. None of this 6 foot deep. It was a case of there's space, the body goes in, simple as. It was burials after burials after burials after burials after burials. It is a human lasagna, as I like to call it. That's exactly what it is. And then when you couldn't dig anymore because there was bodies, what they would do is they'd bring the body, then they'd bring earth from outside and put that on top. This is why we have now got the valley and the bump that we now have, because the bodies were put on and they were just built up. It's insane. Going by the interment records, the ones that we do have, obviously the early ones, 1500s and things like that, they are non-existent. So we can only do a rough guess. You know, from the sort of mid 1600s up to about 1700, we've got 1658 to 1700. I mean, we're looking at a volume of interments of a book that's about that thick. With just names after name after name after name after name. So you're looking about round about an estimation of about 750,000 bodies in this space. It is, yeah, that is full. That is very, very full.
You may notice that near some of these tombstones there are bars in the roof area. This was to create a sort of cage-like environment to prevent body snatchers from stealing fresh bodies and selling them to local doctors for them to be studied for medicine. Just past Mackenzie's tomb. Here's Jamie with an interesting tale that will chill you to this place.
But of course there's the dark side of it. It's now also known as one of the world's most haunted locations due to interactions with people over the years since 1999. In a locked off area off the graveyard called the Covenanters Prison. There is some belief that the graveyard itself, outside, anywhere in the graveyard, you know, you're susceptible to an attack of some description, or you know, which is very untrue. The epicenter of this study, and indeed what is now known as the Mackenzie poltergeist, is the epicenter is the Covenanters Prison and one mausoleum within the Covenanters Prison. It's very confusing. A lot of people do get confused because the Mackenzie mausoleum, which indeed the Mackenzie poltergeist is named after, the mausoleum, not any particular Mackenzie. It's called after the mausoleum. That is in the main graveyard, the big domed structure. There's not just one Mackenzie in there. There's several. There's 11 Mackenzies in that mausoleum. And another 23 other people as well who are not Mackenzies. But that again shows you how space was needed. So it's well known for you know, some people would have you believe that the ex, you know, King's Advocate, Lord Justice, Sir George Mackenzie of Rose Hall is somehow running about after death, you know, scratching people up when they visit the locked section of Greyfriars Kirkyard, which, you know, couldn't be further from the truth. There's unfortunately too many people nowadays who like to read something on a website and take it as fact without actually, you know, doing their own research. You know, it's something I've always insisted on doing. Looking into something properly. You cannot be an expert on something for reading a couple of websites or read a book. George Mackenzie, I think, in history in Scotland is one of the most misunderstood people, I think, thanks to social media and today's elements. Now, Sir George Mackenzie was Lord Advocate of Scotland. He wrote the laws of Scotland. He was one under the King. He'd worked his entire life to get to where he was. You know, he studied law. He was born in Dundee. He studied law in St Andrews. He studied law in Glasgow, and then he studied law abroad in Italy. He was the top of his game. He was Lord Advocate. So he'd done his time as defence lawyer and prosecution lawyers. He'd done his time in the bar. Now, what people tend to think of George Mackenzie is how he hated the Covenanters. He was persecuted. You know, Bloody Mackenzie, his nickname was, which wasn't actually brought around until the Romanticism novels of Walter Scott and that period where everybody needed a baddie in the fantasy novels. And of course, George Mackenzie, being the height of authority, was the one that got it. Anybody who studied George Mackenzie, certainly as much as I have, will be able to tell you straight away that George Mackenzie never killed a single person with his own hands, yet he is, you know, labelled with murdering thousands of Covenanters. Not a single one. Even in today's world, in a chamber of law. Now, back in the days of the 1600s, there was obviously the Covenanting movement that was going on. The Covenanters were nothing to do with freedom or, you know, Scottish independence. They were basically, we didn't want the Anglicisation of the Scottish Church, like England. You know, we did not recognise the King as the head of the Church. We recognised God as the head of the Church. That was it. Presbyterian, Scottish Presbyterian, simple. We were like, God save the King, but don't mess with our religion. We don't want your bishops. We don't want your prayer books. You know, stop changing the words in the prayer books to make it our kingly saviour, our kingly God. You know, there's us, there's the King, then there's God. God save the King. We will not take up arms, but you do not change our religion. We are not interested. End of. But of course, when you've got the Stuart Kings who were as paranoid as they were, they wanted to make change, and of course it was all come to a head between obviously James and then Charles II. So, basically at that time, you were with the King or you were against the King. Okay? There was no middle ground. You know, there was none of this, well, maybe they're right, we'll just let them go, we're, you know, open to all religions. No, you were with the King or against the King. If the King thought that he was bigger than God, if you didn't agree with him, you're against him, it's high treason. No matter what level you're on, it's high treason. The punishment for high treason, as it was for centuries, was hung, drawn, quartered. That was it. William Wallace. Hung, drawn, quartered. Even England, Scotland rule was exactly the same. High treason. So, if you were against the King, it was high treason. So he then made it, well, if you don't agree with me that I'm the head of the church, then it's high treason, I want you all killed. Now, some people would have you believe that Sir George Mackenzie was going out on the street and rounding up these Covenanters in the street and then, you know, taking them and then just murdering them, cutting their heads off and spiking their heads on gates and torturing them and all that jazz. No. George Mackenzie was against the use of torture, for a start. That, he's actually stood up in court, he defended Covenanters in court, and saying this, that this self-statement was taken under the duress of torture. How can somebody make a decision when your body is in that much pain? Your body's almost shutting down. How can you be consciously making a decision like that? And he did. And that was the first time that he could have lost his life for that, because, you know, he was shown almost support. But he took a chance, and he was well respected enough to do it, and he did. The second time that he almost could have lost his life is when he started the act for the abolition of witch trials. It was that George Mackenzie, same one who murdered all these people, the misogynist, who abolished witch trials in Scotland. Because again, under torture, and he just couldn't believe that a female subject in front of him could change into an animal, or could have the influence to change a weather system. He just found that unbelievable, and he actually stood up in court. He said, if you believe that, sir, then maybe it's you that has the problem. You know, and that was because it was George Mackenzie. People actually went, well, actually, maybe he's right. Maybe he's got a thing here. You know, but again, people would have you believe he's this horrible, murderous, torturous, you know. When he was Lord Advocate, sitting judge, of course he sent people to their death because it was his job, you know. A judge's feelings does not come into it. A judge is there to pass sentence. These Covenanters were already found guilty of high treason in a court. It's the judge's job to pass sentence, as it is today. It's exactly the same. So yes, he did send people to their deaths because it was what the law said, and he had to follow the law. If he'd shown any sort of leniency towards them, his personal feelings didn't come into it, he would be on the stocks and he would be hung, drawn and quartered because he'd be shown leniency and he'd then be against the king. He'd also then be in high treason. He wasn't about to throw that away for his own personal feelings because he knew how dangerous it was. But he persevered, and of course Presbyterian became a thing. So he was thinking off. But of course people then would say, well, you know, he hated the Covenanters that much. You know, it was him that imprisoned them. He came and tortured them in the prison. I'd like to state right now, George Mackenzie, at the time that the prisoners were brought from Bothwell Brig in 1679, the last battle between Covenanters and government troops, we don't know why they weren't executed. They were beaten, the Covenanters were beaten at the battle. They weren't executed on sight for some reason. They decided that they were going to bring them to Edinburgh for a summary court case. Whether it was a show of, this is really what happens now, stop. You know, we don't know. Either way, 1,200 men were rounded up and they were marched to Edinburgh. Now, there was nowhere big enough in Edinburgh to put 1,200 men. The Covenanter, the Carlton jail, not a chance. There was nowhere big enough, you know, so they're like, well, what do we do? So there is documentation on this. The troops had to hold the men outside Edinburgh for 3 nights, purely because the paperwork that they needed to be signed to use an area of Greyfriars Kirkyard, which is now the South Yard, the church had bought the land to the south. They'd bought the land basically to use as a burial ground, an extension of the graveyard. This was 1675. That land was purchased. The walls had been put up basically to bring it in. The Flodden wall was already existent, so that was the boundary wall, and they bought the land, so they basically were going to open up the south and start building, burying people in that area. However, the battle in 1679 stopped that. Somebody had the idea, well, why don't we keep them in that holding area? It's not been used for burials yet, but the church do own it. There's only one person in this country who could sign the paperwork to overrule the church on a matter of land, because it wasn't a matter of God, it was just a land matter, was George Mackenzie, Lord Advocate. He could overthrow the church on that and say, right, well, I'm basically acquiring that land for a short lease. You have it back when I'm finished, but I'm taking that land off you. The government, the Crown, is taking that land for 4 months. Problem was, George Mackenzie was in London at the time. This is why the men were held for 3 nights before they could enter Edinburgh, because the paperwork wasn't signed. And we know that because the person had to come back from London with the paperwork. That's why they were held up. So that proves that George Mackenzie wasn't even in Edinburgh when these men were here. George Mackenzie never once visited the Covenanters prison. He had nothing to do with it whatsoever. He only signed the paperwork for it to be allowed to be used as a makeshift prison for 4 months. And that was it. But yeah, there's some people who tell you that he was down here, he was murdering women and children, who of course came from the battlefield. You know, the amount of stories, it's so misrepresented, it's unbelievable. But everybody needs a baddie, but that's no excuse to be making up, you know, how he was, allegedly he was also responsible for bricking people up at Mary King's Close. I've heard that one. He was accused of the children being bricked up in the nursery on the Royal Mile, which again never happened, certainly not by him, and it never happened anyway. You know, it's all these things over time that unfortunately people have, like urban legends, but unfortunately because of social media these things can grow arm and legs, and you know, do I believe that Sir George Mackenzie of Rose Hall, Lord Advocate of Scotland, is running about a graveyard after death, scratching people and attacking? No, of course I don't. You know, he didn't interact with, you know, people like us in his life. Why would he interact with people now? You know, he is buried in here purely because this is another thing as well, that he hates the Covenanters and he was against the Presbyterian way of life, and you know, he wanted to be buried in a Presbyterian graveyard. He asked to be buried here. Not because to wind up the souls of the Covenanters in the prison, it's nothing to do with that. That's another myth. It's because at that time the church wasn't the size it is now, and before the new part was built, at that time you could see right over Edinburgh, you could see right over down the Royal Mile, you could see St Giles Spire and things, so the view, that is why George Mackenzie wanted to be buried there, because of the view, and he was Lord Advocate. If he wanted to be buried there, then he was. His mausoleum was built 40 odd years before he died. So he knew exactly where he was going. It was nothing to do with the Covenanters and winding the spirits up and that. Like I said, he'd already defended after the whole Presbyterian came in and it was abolished that it wasn't high treason to. There was a lot of Covenanters still being held in conditions, and he defended them and got them out with them and basically saved their life. But people forget about all that, or they just don't do their own research. They just rather read, a website and see how this torturous, the
What do you think of? What do you think of the other theory about the black mausoleum, of it being the family who didn't want to be interred into the mausoleum?
I've not heard that theory actually. I mean, again though, this is where people get confused because of online. The Black Mausoleum and the Mackenzie Mausoleum are two different mausoleums. Now, this comes about because of tour companies, who do their own thing. That's absolutely fine, but they do not have access to the Black Mausoleum in the Covenanters prison. It's only City of the Dead that have the access to that, the ones that brought you the Mackenzie Poltergeist. So they will take their groups around the graveyard and they will stop outside the Mackenzie Mausoleum and they will tell you, this is the Black Mausoleum. Yes, it's dark coloured because of obviously the stone over time, it's black. It is the Mackenzie Mausoleum, that's correct, but it's not the Black Mausoleum. That's just his burial chamber. The main factor of that is how people have been attacked inside it. I don't understand. One, it's only 8 foot by 8 foot inside. How you've got 30 odd people, 40, 50 people in that space. I'm not surprised people were coming out with scratches because they'd be crawling over themselves to get out because you'd be crammed. Second, the public have never had access to that mausoleum at all. It has never been open to the public. There has never certainly been open to tour companies. So how people have been attacked inside it and recorded it, that, good luck.
I'm only going off what Ben was saying last night, that there was a man who bought and built the Black Mausoleum, and his family said to him, "No, this is where you're going to be."
No, that I know where Ben's coming from that.
Right,
no,
okay.
That goes back to when it was built in 1691. Sorry, 1680 something. No, at the time before the Mackenzie had his mausoleum built, there was another mausoleum there, but they moved it.
Right.
That was the Foresters, funnily enough, the Foresters of Corstorphine, which is my surname, Corstorphine. They were there, but that mausoleum, because the family had run out, basically there was no more burials to be had. What they did is they basically picked up, it was an enclosure, so it was just walls. So what they did is they took the bricks, they dismantled it, and they built it too long. Now we know that because the Forester name from the front of the old one, where it used to stand, is in the back wall at the bottom. I don't know why they've put it in the back wall at the bottom, because they could have just put it back, because it was brick for brick. So that was moved too long. However, they didn't move the bodies. The bodies remained, which is where it comes into the story, which I'll explain in a second. So that was what they did. Now when they moved the mausoleum, obviously you've got the burial. So what they did is they just put a thin floor down, and then it was flat, and then they put the burial chamber for Mackenzie, and then they built the main bit up here. So you've got basically the bit where you look in the doors of the Mackenzie Mausoleum, that's the ground. You've got a bit that goes down to the burial chamber. Under that, the Foresters are one under that, with a thin slate floor. So what happened was, in 1998, a homeless guy was looking for somewhere to spend the night. It was horrendous wind, rain, and he got into the Mackenzie Mausoleum via the back. There is a space at the back of the mausoleum, it's a square. It was open at that point, it's now obviously meshed over. For a thin person you could get through it no problem at all, that's exactly what he did. And the wind was rattling through the mausoleum, so he opened the gate to go down to the Mackenzie burial chamber, because it was like shelter. I mean, the guy I don't think was causing any malice, he just wanted shelter, and it was cover. What he didn't know though, as soon as he stood on that slate floor, that was when he went through the floor. and that is when he hit the body dump. Now, unfortunately, I do have to say one thing about Jan's original documentation of it from when he brought it to the public. At that time, Jan had said it was a plague dump that the guy had fallen into. We now know that there was no plague victims buried in Greyfriars. You know, there was too many of them. This place would be higher than the castle if that was the case. They were buried outside the city. They were diseased. They didn't put them in parish graveyards. One, it takes up far too much space, and two, they're diseased, so they would be put in mass burial. But the guy did fall into what remains of the Seven Forrester family. Again, going back by the Book of Interments, you can see that. You can tell because it says the Forresters and it says how many's there. So that was what he fell into. So he did fall into a body dump, but it wasn't plague victims. I think that was just a little bit of embellishment on the story part to make it more thingy. So that did happen, and that's what we think is the pivotal moment, because when he went down, he grabbed what he could and he grabbed a coffin. And of course the coffin came down. It didn't break open, but it cracked, and the coffin was disturbed. So we think at that point, because literally I think it was about 4 days later, that is when the first recorded instances were coming through from within the Covenanters prison area. Not outside the Mackenzie Mausoleum, it was in the prison area. That was when the prison was open to the public. You could walk around it, and that was the case. People were walking around as they do. But in that one area, in the prison area, that's where the reports were coming out of. People were getting knocked out cold. There was 11 ambulances called in the space of 3 months for people who were found unconscious. We're not talking about like the local jakies, you know, we're talking about just normal people. They were just found lying on the ground. So of course the media then picked up on this. This was the end of 1998. The local media, Edinburgh Evening News, picked up on it. And they started, you know, talking to people who had, you know, complained that there were things, and they were like, oh, the strange happenings in Greyfriars Kirkyard. So that was fine. It was getting a bit of media attention. Then they took the decision to organise for an exorcism to be done. Nothing to do with us. We weren't established at that point. Jan, my boss, the owner of City of the Dead, he thought this would be a great book because he was looking at the newspaper articles going, this is unbelievable. The sheer amount of people that are saying that they've been scratched or attacked, or, you know. So he's like, this would make a great book. So he was already starting to document it all and started, you know, this is really interesting. Again, it didn't have a name at this point. It was just the strange happenings and, you know, these sinister spectres and things like that. So they organised the exorcism to be done by a local medium called Colin Grant. He was a very well respected medium, a clairvoyant from Edinburgh, very well known in the city. So they organised for him, obviously with cameras and everything else, one evening to come out and do an exorcism in Greyfriars. Of course, cameras are rolling. So about an hour into it, he collapses and he says, I can't do this, it's too strong, it's too strong, it'll kill me. So of course the media was like, so that was it. Exorcist is laid down. The exorcist, you know, can't deal with Greyfriars. The entity of Greyfriars is too strong. And, oh God. So of course the media is getting a bit more. Jan's like, this is great. So he started talking to people going around and things like that. Now, literally 6 days after that, unfortunately, Colin Grant is doing a private reading in his home for somebody. I believe it was a tarot card reading. He was doing a reading for them, and present was the woman he was doing the reading for, and of course his wife. His son was extremely young at that point, and he is doing the reading, and suddenly he stops, and he just stops and he looks at the woman and he says, Greyfriars, there's no good news, there's just bad. Bang, his heart stopped, he dropped dead. Witnessed by his wife and this woman. So of course, you can imagine, the media just went, exorcist killed by Greyfriars. So of course the media storm was unbelievable. People were coming from all over the world, there was news crews, there was everything. Now, this is where the council step in and they go, right, this is our land. This is a burial ground, we're not having this. Unfortunately, it was attracting the wrong kind of people as well. The ghost hunting groups there were climbing over walls, they were climbing on stones, they were setting up cameras, they were leaving their wires lying everywhere, people were tripping over all their gear, they were getting angry because people were knocking their gear. It's a public area, although it's owned by the council, it is still open to the public. So yeah, the council went, you know what, this is it, we're shutting the gates. So they did. They locked the gates, and the problem solved. Can't go in, so that'll stop it. So that was their way of just saying enough's enough. So Jan, of course, was still writing the book. He was like, so he used to live in a flat just there. So he came down one day, gates were locked, and he was like, what's going on? So he eventually got hold of the council departments, and he was like, look, I'm writing a book. I need to speak to people who have been in there, you know, and get their, you know, feelings if they felt anything. Maybe they've not, you know. But I need to speak to people for research. You know, I've already carried this on. I've done all this, and I'd like to carry on. And they went, no. What do I do? Does he just throw all this research away for the past sort of almost year, or what does he do? He's like, right. So he had to think about it. And what he decided was, well, what's the best way to get people from all over the world, different beliefs, different backgrounds, you know, different outlooks. Right, okay. So what he did was he went back to the council, he organised a meeting. There was a deal struck between them. Basically, he went in with public liability insurance. And he said, this is my name. My name. I want to take people into that area. I want access to it. I want to rent that area from you. As a tenant, you could be the landlord. We'll also take on the office, the old gatehouse that's hardly got a roof on it. We'll use that as an office. So we will be basically giving you rent for 2 properties that you won't be getting anything for. And like I said, public liability insurance, it's on my head, so that covers. Council got nothing to do with it. We're just your tenants. And of course, they said yes. So that was it. 1999, Jan then got sole access to the Covenanters prison to continue the documentation of what is now the most documented paranormal case in the world, I believe. But obviously, it's known then the church was established in the 1600s for worship. It was the first post-Reformation church of Scotland. That's why it's a very design. Although the church standing here is not the original church, this is the third attempt at Greyfriars Church. The first one was blown up by Cromwell by accident. They were storing gunpowder. Second one was hit by a storm and there was a fire and it gutted it. Absolutely gutted it. So throughout the sort of late 1800s, the church was actually a shell. There's old Greyfriars and there's new Greyfriars. The two churches are combined, but at that point, the old Greyfriars, it was just a shell, so they were still using a part of it until the most recent one that was opened on Christmas Day in the 1920s. So that's what we have now. But, you know, historic-wise, in the grounds of Greyfriars, you know, it was the only burial ground for such a long time. So anybody who was anybody, you know, is in here, and even the not anybody is in here as well. Yeah, entire families, generations of families, and things like that. A lot of connections, you know, well known for their time people as well. Walter Scott's father. You know, places like James Craig, who designed Newtown, the Adam family, Robert Adam, William Adam, the architects. You know, I can go on, loads of Lord Provosts, mayors, you know, doctors, surgeons, some of the finest surgeons, the first proper surgeon in Edinburgh when it switched from, you know, this all-round surgeon that could probably cut your hair and do your surgery and take a gallbladder out or something like that, you know. But the first specialised surgeon, James Borthwick, he's here as well on the church, well, just in front of the church. So that's his dancing skeleton that's on the side of the church that everybody likes to think is, or is told recently that it's a criminal whose skin was flayed, and this is a, yes, the stories that some people can tell you is, yeah.
The building you can see behind the gates here is actually a school. The school itself is divided into 4 houses. Colours for those houses are red, green, yellow and blue. These might sound familiar to some of you. Now, no visit to Greyfriars would be complete without hearing the tale of a certain little dog. Here's Jamie with the tale of Greyfriars Bobby, and give you an example of fact between fiction.
Great. So, Greyfriars Bobby, the wee dog that sat on his master's grave for 14 years. So, obviously everybody's heard well, not everybody I would imagine, but most people know the story. They know the story. Now, what we have to remember is going back to 1911 when Eleanor Atkinson actually wrote the story for the first time. She was the first person to put it to print. She brought it to the public. She wrote it as a book to sell. It wasn't an informational booklet. It wasn't a newspaper article. It wasn't it was a book. It was a novel to sell. So, Eleanor Atkinson was an American lady who never left her home state of America. She never travelled to Scotland. She never travelled outside America. But she wrote Greyfriars Bobby. So, how did she know about this story? She obviously heard it from Scots going across to America. It's no wild thing, especially in Indiana area and stuff like that. The mountains, and then you've got the Appalachian Mountains and things like that. It was all set up by Scots. So Scotsmen were across there. They would be bringing our traditions and customs and, banter and alcohol, whiskey probably. Now, she wouldn't be able to speak to these Scotsmen when they were working. Obviously, they were working. You can't just have a woman coming and just chilling out with you and just sitting down while you're, doing whatever they were doing. So the only time she would be able to speak to them would be in a bar, probably after, some spit saloon or something like that, that's been set up in a rickety shack. So this is how she would get the story. So of course, anybody that's ever been to Scotland and talked to a Scotsman in a pub, you'll know that we love to embellish in the stories, but especially after a few whiskies. Oh yeah, Billy Connolly is a fine example. That's exactly. So you can imagine somebody sitting down like a Billy Connolly type person speaking to this American lady who's one trying to understand what the man's saying, and two trying to get some sense out of him. Oh, me dog's lying on the ground. Me master died 40 years. Oh, I poor me dog. So I can't believe it was word for word for a start. Straight away, there's no way that she could write down and dictate exactly how she heard this story from a random Scotsman or two random Scotsmen. So, that aside, she wrote Greyfriars Bobby about this poor little Doug who is a dog to a shepherd called John Gray. They come to Edinburgh from the Highlands. My second issue with that is, why would he come to the centre of Edinburgh? There's no agricultural fields or anything in this area for at least 6 miles, which is Collington. That's the nearest place at that time that would have agricultural fields. The centre of Edinburgh was just brick. There's no jobs for shepherds in the centre of Edinburgh. None. So why he came to the centre of Edinburgh looking for work, that has to be questioned as well, because it would never have happened.
According to the Disney movie,
Yes.
and as we know, we can say that with a pinch of salt, he came to Edinburgh because he'd basically been forced to retire due to his age.
Yeah, I think that was a nice way of saying as well from the Highland clearances and stuff. I think they were putting a bit of that into how he was forced to leave, because one, he wasn't as fit as a young person now, i.e. he wasn't as fit as the machinery that would come in and be able to do the job. So I think there was a bit of that with the Disney thing as well, trying to get obviously Disney are not known for their factual documentaries.
Jumping Lemons jumps to mind for some reason.
Yeah. So either way though, yeah, he came to the centre of Edinburgh. The story was he was here for 2 years, and then he passed away with tuberculosis. Of course, then the dog was heartbroken. So the dog then, after he was allegedly buried in Greyfriars, the dog stayed on his grave for 14 years. So, scientifically, your body starts to decompose about an hour and a half after death. The smell would not be his master's smell, so the fact he smelt his master in the ground, whether it would be 6 foot or 3 foot down, that alone, no. That would never have happened. Even if he followed the coffin and he smelt the coffin before it was put in the ground, as soon as that dirt and that goes over it, and of course the body inside, no, that smell would be long gone. Second issue I have with that is a Skye Terrier. Now, I know quite a few, obviously working here, we do have the annual Bobby commemorative. We've got a lot of Skye Terrier owners that come in. I speak to loads of them as soon as I see a Skye Terrier, because they're wonderful dogs, extremely dozy, but they're wonderful upside down mobs. But they're lovely dogs, absolutely lovely dogs. You can see out their hair. So I've spoken to a few, and there is not one of them have confirmed with me that they have had a Skye Terrier more than 13 years. They don't have a long life, they're ratter dogs. Even well looked after. So how a dog lasted for 14 years living rough in a Scottish graveyard when you had humans that didn't hardly last 4 months in a Scottish graveyard with the Covenanters. So, people say, well, he had a shelter. He did have a shelter. He had the 2 gravestones down there that he would go under when it rained. He also would be in here. This office was built in 1834 to combat the grave robbing period. This is for the families to sit in and look out. At Bobby's time, this would have been James Brown's tool shed. James Brown was the sexton of the graveyard. He looked after the graveyard. He was the one that was here every day with the dog. So yeah, the dog would have been in here. The dog would have been at the open fire, so he did have places to go. I doubt James would have left him in overnight. You know, at first, James Brown didn't really want the dog in because he's a ratter. It's good for the rats. We still have rats in Greyfriars. However, when the dog starts digging, it's not the best, you know, thing to be doing in a graveyard. So, you know, it would have been, James would have been kind of balanced on it. Did he want a dog to feed and look after? He was merely a sexton of a graveyard, you know, so he wasn't in a high-paid position. Did he want to have the thing of a dog to look after and feed? Could he afford it? Probably not. However, people would come to the graveyard, Victorian time, and they would walk around the graveyard. James would be doing his thing, you know, cutting the grass or tidying things up. And he would show them around, he would speak to the people, he'd say, right, this is the Denniston monument. You know, the Denniston were a very, very popular family. It was James Brown who done the great book, the epitaphs and memorials of Greyfriars Kirkyard. While he was working here, he documented every single stone and drew them and wrote them down in a book. You can get it today still, reprinted. Some of the stones are no longer here, so his documentation, absolutely unbelievable. But that's what he did. So he would go around, he would tell people about the things, and of course at the end of it they would say, thank you for your time, sir, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. Here's something for yourself, look after yourself, sir. So of course this was great. He would have a little side earner, you know, kind of tour guide if you wish. But this little dog, James is walking about and this little dog was hungry because James was like, I can't feed you, I'm on a pittance myself. However, this poor little dog, people are walking around, he's like, oh, what can I do? You know, his poor master's died, he's buried, you know, and this dog's just hanging around, and the poor dog's obviously heartbroken, and what can I do as an honest citizen is I have to look after this poor animal, this poor wretched animal. He's taken a shine to me, what can I do? I can't leave him, he's heartbroken. So of course at the end they'd say, thank you for your time, sir, and get yourself something very special for your little friend. So there you go. So, we don't know if it was James Brown that brought John Gray, Greyfriars. We don't know if it was James Brown who brought the master in and that's how Eleanor Atkinson has heard the story. Or if it was actually Eleanor herself. 1911, nobody really gave two shits about a stray dog. Who wants to read a story about a stray dog? Yeah, it's not nice, but would you actually want to buy a book about a stray dog? Not really. There's loads of them in the streets. Even in the 50s, 60s, you know, growing up, there's stray dogs all there. That's what you need to get a licence. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. Out of sight, out of mind. You know, and certainly not the upper classes, man. They don't really care about stray dogs. I've got my little penny dog for you. However, if you bring this poor master into this poor died master and this poor little dog, heartbroken, that little animal, you have to, because you have to find out if it's alright or not. So, we will never know. We'll never know if it was Eleanor or James that brought John into it. But, you know, having said that, the dog was more than real. We know the dog was real. Like I said, there's newspaper articles. The dog had his own state funeral. The dog was given the keys to the city. You know, you don't just make that up and just throw it in as a conspiracy theory. You know, there's loads of newspaper articles about it. There's people's diaries. We've got writings about it, and the archives. We've got one photograph, two, but the first one's blurred, where the dog's running off the knee. It's the Trail family who used to live up there. The kids used to come down and play with the dog, and they managed to get it in the house because they used to feed it up at the cafe. And the first photograph, I think this is about 1860, so it was a very early photograph. It shows the blur because the dog's just obviously jumped off just at that moment. But the second one, the dog's actually sitting on the knee, and you can see the dog. So that's the only photograph in existence of the dog. But there's plenty of life drawings. There's plenty of life paintings, different artists. So again, they're not all just making it up. You know, the dog was real. The dog was very real. And he was, you know, the dog was loved by the people of Edinburgh. People would come from all over. He was a celebrity, you know, because of the story and because he was getting well known. You know, well, at the time, we're not talking about 1911 when Eleanor wrote the book. Obviously, this is still when the dog was alive. So, you know, he did have, you know, and he was well looked after. The fact as well that Baroness Coutts, you know, a year after he died, actually paid for the monument to be put in. You know, that's how much of an impact this little stray dog had. And he was well loved, yeah, he was well loved. But there is discrepancies with that, going back to the time of 14 years that the dog was here. There is discrepancies between the photograph and a couple of the life paintings and the description. For a start, the main discrepancy is why the statue that was done from life, literally later stages of the dog's life, it was done from life. Why is that not a Skye Terrier? It's nothing like a Skye Terrier. Yet the early drawings and the early paintings clearly show him as a Skye Terrier, with the ears down here. You know, that's more a Cairn Terrier, more a Downy Diamond Terrier. It's not a Skye Terrier. So why is that then? That then brings in the theory that there was more than one dog. I think an author, Jan Bodison, I think he touched on that subject in his book that he researched. I personally, after looking through the archives, that is one of the main conclusions that would certainly explain a good few discrepancies. One, the time. Two, the differences between the life paintings of the dog later in life and the early ones and the early descriptions. Again, you know, we didn't have all this information in front of us. You know, if they've got a dog that roughly looked the same sort of colouring, you know, I mean, people weren't coming down to see him daily. They were coming, you know, maybe monthly or maybe once, you know. So it wasn't like you didn't have Facebook, that the posts were going up and there was a whole bloody page dedicated to it. You know, so people couldn't, you know, maybe there'd been a few people that were times like, that looks a bit strange. Oh, he's not feeling well. You know, he's lost a bit of weight, you know. You know, if James was getting the money from people coming to see this dog, and, you know, of course he wanted to. A lot of people say, oh, the council were in on it. I don't think the council were in on it at all. I don't think the council even really cared about it. James certainly did, though. And anything to top his wages of, I could certainly understand. It was bringing people to the graveyard, and the more people came, the more he got to show around, the more money, tips and things he got, and, you know, gifts, and, yeah. And it was making James important as well, you know, just this sexton who just cuts the grass in a graveyard became, you know, everybody came to see him and the dog, so he was loving it. He was loving the attention as well, which I totally understand. You know, it's just no different than putting a photo up online for likes. You know, it's exactly the same. So, yeah, I do believe, in the research that I have done personally, I do believe that the dog, of course, was very real. Even both of them. Possibly three of them. The dog was very real, so the story is true. The dog was here, and he was in the graveyard, and he was here for a long time. The master, though, the biggest knockback for that is there is no interment record for a John Gray in Greyfriars the year he died. You know, that's again the reason why his name can't go on that board outside. You know, you got on the board outside, you've got some of the most noble and the most recognised people to be buried in Greyfriars. Sir George Mackenzie, William Smellie, you've got the Botanics Encyclopedia, you've got obviously Lord Provost, famous Lord Provost, you've also got even William McGonagall, his name's on there.
Yeah, the worst part who I've existed, isn't it?
But John Gray's had a Disney movie made about him. He's had countless books written about him. He's one of the most famous dog owners in the world. But his name can't go on that board because we've got no burial record for him in here. So, that alone says John never existed. There's no paper trail. We've even searched police records for employment, just in case, employment, because you can get police employment records. It's all archived. You can go through them for the years that he supposedly worked as a policeman. No, there's no John Gray. There is John Grays that worked for the police, and there is John Grays buried here. We've got 17 John Grays here in Greyfriars. However, not 6 years either side of when he allegedly died. 6 years is a big gap. All the interments were done in order. So there's not a case, we forgot one. It was all done in order. So there's no. Maybe he was real. But he's certainly not buried in Greyfriars if he was real. That's, I'm not going to say he didn't exist, because that's just me surmising from what research I've done. But maybe there's something I've not looked at. I haven't looked at the Collington burial records. Maybe there's a John Gray buried, there the year he died, in which case that would then throw open to maybe he was buried in Collington there. Because there has been chat about John Gray was indeed in Collington, near the agricultural fields and stuff. But again, why was the dog here then? So, yeah. The dog was very real, but unfortunately, so far, we can't prove that the master was real. But it's still a good story of devotion. The dog was devoted to the people of Edinburgh. In Edinburgh, especially James Brown, he was devoted to the dog, because he was, and he did care about the dog. Stop rubbing the bobby raw. Yeah. Can't do nothing but rub raw bobby. Brilliant.